paper, the second paper of today, is a paper of Lord Christopher Monckton, and we have to say that he has an interesting career in UK politics and also in the field of journalism. He served as a political advisor to Conservatives and already published in several newspapers. His, we can say, classical lecture and era of temperature feedback analysis and its consequences shall be taken as a proof that of his coherent opinion on the climate change. That is said that the costs of the climate change mitigation are underestimated and benefits of it are overstated.
This 15-second term will change your weight loss. No diets, no exercise needed. You may not know this, but the real reason some people stay effortlessly slim while others struggle to lose weight isn't about calories or exercise. It's all...
I'm sorry, maybe some ghosts of the Houses of Parliament in Czech Republic, but now I will pass the word to the Viscount Monckton of Branchley and his paper called An Era.
Right. Madam Chairman, and my fellow seekers after truth, the ambassadors of the Czech Republic to the Climate Intelligence Group are to be warmly congratulated for having organized this high-level scientific conference for leading researchers worldwide. It's an honor to be invited to address this meeting of great minds, and it is a particular pleasure to see students and their professors here, which I don't think would happen in Britain. And it shows that the Czech Republic, a country which I have come to love, still knows what freedom is and understands that hearing both sides of the argument is the best way to reach the truth. Now, worldwide warmer weather... now, wait a minute, this is not functioning. Ah, there we are. Thank you, good. Is proving handsomely net beneficial, yet climatologists predict it will become harmful. Now, why is this? Well, it is because they borrowed what is called feedback formalism from control theory, a branch of electronic engineering physics, but they fatally misunderstood what they had borrowed. They made a grave and striking error without which the climate emergency vanishes away. Next one. The sun, by way of the emission temperature R0, as we will label it here, that would obtain if there were no greenhouse gases in the air at the outset and no feedbacks had yet acted, will directly contribute 90% of today's global surface temperature. Yet, in effect, at a vital point in their calculations of how much global warming we may cause, climatologists forgot the sun was shining. They left out the sunshine temperature from the feedback loop. This is a grave and fundamental error. Next slide, please. First, some points of notation. In this presentation, feedback variables will be in blue, and they will be upright in Roman face. All others will be in italics and in various colors. Uncorrected feedback variables will be lowercase. When corrected, they will be in capitals. Time subscripts are 0 at emission temperature. Wait a minute, we've got to go one back, please. Can we go one slide back, please? You're on the wrong slide. That's it, thank you. 1 in 1850 and 2 in 2024, following the anthropogenic radiative forcing since 1850, which is approximately equivalent to doubling the CO2 in the air. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, thank you. The IPCC in 2013 mentions the word feedback more than 1,100 times, and in 2021, more than 2,500 times. Now, why is this? It is because they thought that feedbacks drove most of the global warming. However, it will be shown here that climatologists are using an incorrect method to predict global warming, and worse, they're using that incorrect method incorrectly. Next slide, please. Since the 1979 Charney report, it's been imagined, wrongly, as it will turn out, that doubling the CO2 in the air would cause 2 to 5 Celsius of warming, with a 3 Celsius mid-range estimate. And that's been the case in most of the IPCC reports as well. Now, of this warming, up to 4/5, as you'll see at the bottom right there, is predicted to arise from what is called feedback response, an indirect extra warming driven by the 1 Celsius direct warming by doubled CO2 in the air. Next slide, please. First, some data. Temperature was at equilibrium in 1850. There would be no trend for 80 years thereafter, neither up nor down. Now, the equilibrium temperature of 288 Kelvin, which is on the left there, measured that year, was the sum of the 260 Kelvin sunshine temperature, the 8 Celsius of direct warming by doubled CO2, by natural greenhouse gases, and then, we hadn't come into the picture yet, 20 Celsius of feedback response. Next slide, please. The error first emerged in a paper in 1984, and you can see the quotation there. It was imagined that feedback response would multiply that 1 Celsius of direct warming by doubled CO2 by a closed-loop gain factor, or feedback multiplier, of 3 to 4. And so across the bottom here, you can see that sum. It's very simple. 1 times 3 to 4 equals 3 to 4 Celsius of final warming. So that was where this mistake was first made. And without such a large influence from temperature feedback, no one would ever have predicted large or dangerous warming. In 2007, Sir John Horton, IPCC's first science chair, told me that feedback response would indeed triple or quadruple any anthropogenic direct warming, based on data for 1850 similar to those shown here. Strikingly, however, he omitted the 260 Kelvin sunshine temperature from his equation. Where is the sun? And that will be the theme of this presentation. Next slide, please. And here is the sun. You see that yellow 260 Kelvin? That's the sunshine temperature. That's the largest temperature signal in the whole of the climate. And in feedback analysis, every climatologist on both sides of the debate has, by mistake, left it out. So if we correct Horton's equation by including this predominant 260 Kelvin in the top and bottom of the fraction which is the feedback multiplier, that reduces the multiplier radically and thus reduces final warming by double CO2, which is the standard metric in climate change, from 3.5 Celsius that we saw before just to 1.1 Celsius, and here you can see the two methods directly compared. Note, though, that these values of the final warming assume no change in the feedback regime since 1850 and no unrealized global warming in the pipeline. Well, the first of those two assumptions is made by climatologists generally, and as to the second, once you correct the error of feedback analysis that I shall show you here, then you wouldn't expect any further warming to come from our past sins of emission. Now, after that very brief simplified overview, we now examine in more detail the uncorrected feedback method followed until now in climate science. That incorrect method has directly led to gross over-predictions of global warming and thence to what will turn out to be the baseless notion of a climate emergency. In climatologists' version of the feedback loop, which you see here, the input signal at top left is not, as it should be, the 260 Kelvin emission temperature, nor even the 8 Celsius of natural warming by the greenhouse gases that were already in the air in 1850. Instead, it's just that 1 Celsius of reference sensitivity to, or direct warming by, a forcing equivalent to doubling the CO2 in the atmosphere. So the uncorrected feedback multiplier, little a2, is the reciprocal of 1 minus the uncorrected feedback factor, little h2, and h2 is in that box at the bottom of the loop, which is known as the feedback block. And h is the operant, or the active ingredient in the feedback loop that translates into feedback response. Now, in this next slide, there are several data at the beginning, and we're going to test you on this later, so pay close attention. And below the line, we feed those data into the wrong equations of feedback, which are used in climatology. And all you need to notice about this slide now is that R0, that sunshine temperature, does not appear anywhere in the data above the line that we're going to feed into the wrong feedback equations below the line. And if you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble, you can freeze frame this at any time and have a closer look at these equations to make sure that I'm not fooling you about anything. You can check it, and if you don't like what you see here, write to me at the email address you'll see on the last slide and tell me where we got this wrong. Because that's how science is done. It's not me just telling you this is how it is. If we are wrong about this, then you here in the Czech Parliament and those looking in, feel free to get in touch. We do not think that we know everything, and we are willing to learn if we have made a mistake. Next slide, please. Now, if we combine the equations below the line in the previous slide, you get a feedback intensity in the range 1.6 to 2.6 units of feedback intensity, which are watts per square meter per Celsius, which is a bit of a mouthful. We'll just call them units from here on. And as you can see, 1.6 to 2.6. Now that's above the line. Below the line is the same values deducible from the latest IPCC report, 1.4 to 2.7. So you can see that we have correctly captured the incorrect method that the climatologists are at present using. Next slide, please. Now, this is a table of how each of the feedback variables is calculated using the equations you see in the third row of the table going from left to right. But the most interesting thing about this table is the right-hand column, which is the first derivative of the system response curve of final warming against the net aggregate feedback intensity, which is the fundamental feedback variable, the originating feedback variable in climate. And you can see how rapidly it increases for each extra Celsius degree. And what this means is that the curve is, as we shall now see, a rectangular hyperbola. Thank you, that's it. And the influence of that curve on final warming via the uncorrected method that we're looking at here is the reason why climatologists fear, wrongly, as we shall show, that global warming may suddenly pass a tipping point and shoot off upwards to infinity. It is because of this hyperbolic shape that climatologists have hitherto imagined that if you cross that tipping point, suddenly the whole climate will run away, and to use the words of the latest UN Secretary General, we will all fry, it's all going to be terrible. I can assure you, no, it isn't. And this is also one reason why it's impossible to make reliable predictions of future warming by way of feedback analysis. Now, the corrected method, to which we now turn, sets the 260 Kelvin sunshine temperature as the input to the temperature feedback loop, as it should. And as we shall see, that calms the entire system down. Now, H.S. Black's original feedback amplifier block diagram, and he was at the Bell Labs in New York, of 1934 shows an absolute or input signal coming into the feedback loop from the left, and we have labeled it R0 because that's where the sunshine should come in. And then it passes infinitely round and round that loop via the triangular G gain block at the top and the square H feedback block at the bottom. And the G gain block is what represents the anthropogenic and natural warmings from greenhouse gases. And then E is the output on the right-hand side. And the closed-loop gain factor A at top right in this slide, thank you, is derived from G, which is formerly known as mu, and H, formerly known as beta, but we're using the modern notations G and H in the rest of this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, the Black's colleague, Hendrik Wade Bode, published a textbook from 1945 to 1975 of feedback amplification and how you do it. And here is his central graph of how a feedback loop works. And you can see it's very similar to what we've just seen. And again, you have an absolute input signal. And if you look up in the early chapters of the book, you can see what that input signal is, the input voltage. It's an absolute value. It is not what's called a delta, a small change. It's the big originating signal. Now, at any moment, the feedback processes then extant must respond equally to each degree of the entire reference temperature then obtaining, including the input signal, as this diagram makes clear. Now, here you're looking at just the gain block, and we've taken the feedback block out, so you can get some idea of how the gain block works. So now in the next slide, we see the standard feedback block, this time with the feedback loop in place, and you can see the sunshine temperature coming in at top left. Then it's modified by the greenhouse gases direct warming in the triangular block, and then it goes through the feedback block. So it's inherent in the feedback equations, and here's visible in the standard block diagram that the feedback factor, big H2, must act not only on the perturbation signals represented in the triangular gain block, but also on the predominant sunshine temperature that is the input to the entire feedback system in the climate. You cannot leave it out. Next slide, please. So now, here is the right way to do these sums. And now, if you look above the line at the data we're going to put into the corrected feedback equations below the line, you will see R0 appears there. That is the sunshine temperature. We do not leave it out. We put it in. And now we're going to see what effect that has. Next slide, please. And if you look at this slide, we have taken the equations from the bottom of the previous slide, turned them into a single equation, and then we start with the 2 to 5 Celsius that they predict. And then we work out what would be the originating feedback variable, this net aggregate feedback intensity, that would give you 2 to 5 Celsius. And you can see that once you've corrected, it's only 1/10 of the values they think it is. It's 0.225 to 0.255 units of feedback intensity. And that will give you 2 to 5 Celsius. So each 0.01 units that you add to the feedback intensity would add fully 1 Celsius to the warming from doubled CO2. That's why you can't use feedback analysis at all to predict global warming. That's why it can't be done, because we cannot derive the net aggregate feedback intensity to anything like so fine a resolution as 0.01 because of the uncertainties both in the data and in the way the data interact with each other and in the process understanding. There are these huge uncertainties which also propagate in quadrature through the successive time steps in a model, and that's why you can't use feedback analysis. Now, in the corrected table that you see here, you will notice a striking difference if you look at the right-hand column, which is the derivative of the system response curve of final warming in response to the feedback intensity. And look, it's about 100 Kelvin or Celsius for each 1 unit of feedback intensity. And what that means is that the curve that we're taking the derivative of is, anybody? It's a straight line, or very nearly so, as we can see in this next slide. And there is the straight line. Now, across the predicted 2 to 5 Celsius interval of ECS, which is here on the abscissa on the left-hand side here, the corrected system response curve is indeed appearing to be a straight line. In fact, this is a small segment of a rectangular hyperbola, but it's right near the origin, and therefore it is very, very close to a straight line, which makes taking the derivative very easy. Now, on this slide, what you're seeing here is if IPCC's uncorrected values of feedback intensity on the ordinate across the bottom there are plugged into the corrected feedback equation, repeated at top left, ECS is going to fall on 200 to 1800 Celsius. Now, if it was going to be anything like that, we'd have kind of noticed by now. But this, of course, isn't happening. The only reason you get these silly figures is if we use IPCC's silly values for the feedback intensity from which they get this vastly over-predicted range of global warming. So let's have the next slide, because they forgot to put the sunshine in. That's why they got these silly values. So now, since it is impossible to constrain final warming to find out how much it is by using feedback analysis, we have to use other methods. Now, the 4 methods we're going to show you next are all founded upon real-world observation, not on these ridiculous, useless models. And all 4 methods will cohere, they will agree with one another in indicating about 1 to 2 Celsius of ECS and not the long predicted 2 to 5 Celsius. And all 4 methods, unlike the official method, agree not only with each other, but also with real-world measured temperature change. And that's more than you can say for the IPCC's predictions, which have proven excessive throughout the IPCC's existence. So here is, go back to method 1, would you please, the previous slide. That's it. Method 1 is that if the feedback regime hasn't changed since 1850, which is the assumption, broadly speaking, made by climatologists, and if there is no unrealized global warming in the pipeline, as there won't be once you've corrected this error, then ECS, the final warming by doubled CO2, will be about 1.1 Celsius, as we saw before. Now we go to method 2, and the radiative forcing from all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions since 1850 is about equal to the predicted warming from doubled CO2. Yet, there's only been 1.2 Celsius of global warming since 1850, suggesting that if there is, again, no unrealized global warming in the pipeline, ECS will be, that's the final warming from doubled CO2, it's going to be around 1.2 Celsius degrees. Method 3, IPCC has long predicted 0.2 to 0.5 Celsius per decade of global warming, or 2 to 5 Celsius across the entire 21st century. And that, by coincidence, is the same range as IPCC also predicts for doubling CO2. The two numbers are about the same. Yet, only 0.15 to 0.2 Celsius per decade has been actually measured over almost half a century, since 1979. Therefore, given no Earth energy imbalance, ECS, or final warming, is 1.5 to 2 Celsius on that slide. Now we go to the next slide, number 4. Now this is a much more detailed way of working out how much warming we may cause, but without using feedback analysis. And here our team has done a billion trial Monte Carlo distribution. That was a technique invented by a Polish-American mathematician, Stanisław Ulam, for the Manhattan Project, and it's now a standard method in statistical analysis. And we've used also a simplified version of the energy budget equation. And that shows 0.9 to 2 Celsius of warming, final warming, with a best estimate of 1.3 Celsius, which is at the peak of the Gaussian distribution that the computer produces if you put their values of the variables that go into the feedback equation into that equation. We're using the official values, and look what you get. You do not get 2 to 5 Celsius, you get 1 to 2. So all 4 of these methods agree not at 3 to 5 Celsius, but 1 to 2 Celsius, and our best estimate from these four methods is about 1.1 to 1.3 Celsius. And that is not only harmless, it's actually net beneficial. It's one reason why, in the last 100 years of global warming, the number of deaths per year from people who have died because of bad weather of any kind has fallen by 99%, notwithstanding a fourfold increase in population over the same period. Next slide, please. Now, startlingly, the elementary error of control theoretic physics described here is universal throughout climatology, thanks to ever more specialized scientific disciplines. None of the following diagrams from climate science papers shows emission temperature, the sunshine temperature, 260 Kelvin, as the input to the feedback loop as it should. Here's the first of them. Now, like many feedback diagrams in climate science, this one from 1988 by a friend of the guy who got it wrong originally in 1984 is a converter. It's not even a straightforward feedback amplifier. And like all climate science diagrams and all climate science feedback analyses, there is no sunshine temperature in the input at top left. Instead, you will see that delta there, which means a small change rather than the absolute overall input signal, which is the fact that the sun is shining. And okay, today in the Czech Republic it kind of isn't, but we know it's there all right, and the climatologists now have to be let in on the secret that you can't leave it out. Let's have a look at another of these. And again, you see no sunshine. And again, let's do another. Another. Go on, next slide. No sunshine. And another. Keep going. No sunshine, and another, 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 and another, and another, and there you go. That covers a period of 30 years of climate science. Not one of the papers on climate sensitivity that we can find on any side of the debate gets this right. But if you go to any control theorist and you say, do we have to include an input signal when it's as large as 260 Kelvin, 90% of the entire planetary temperature, they will say, yes, in that case, you have to include it. You cannot just do a delta analysis, which is what they do in climate science. So that shows you the extent and broadness of the error. So can we just go back one slide, please? Back, please. That's it. Now, several of my team have suffered, some of them greatly, to bring you this result after a decade of research. Your mission, my fellow seekers after truth, is to try to find any errors of substance in the short paper that underlies this brief lecture. Millions in the West will suffer from needless mitigation policies until the truth prevails. Consider just one of many harms arising not just from global warming, but rather from misguided policies intended, however piously, to address it. Importuned by a single communist-led front group, these banks and other institutions have ceased to lend to Africa over recent years for urgently needed coal-fired power. Because coal-fired power is cheap, they've got plenty of coal, and it's low-tech, so that it's easy for them to maintain it. And the result of this well-meaning, no doubt, but catastrophic policy can now be seen on the next slide, please. This is our satellite image of Africa at night. You can see it's on its side, and you've got southern Europe at the left, a blaze of light, but virtually no lights on anywhere in Africa. Africa, because of our climate policies, is literally the dark continent. And if you talk to any African president or leader, they will all say to you that climate change policy is racism. And it is high time, therefore, next slide please, that we correct this monstrous error, this error of errors, this central error. before the West acting almost alone, because the East already knows of our result, and they are therefore increasing coal-fired consumption very cheerfully and very happily, knowing that it will not harm the planet. But the West will destroy its economies if we go on with this needless, costly mitigation. Let's just look briefly at the Czech Republic. If you went in a straight line from here to net zero emissions by 2050, the UN's target year, do you know how much the world's temperature would be less than if you carried on as you are? You would reduce global temperature if you got to net zero, which you won't and you don't need to now, by 1/4000th of a Celsius degree at a cost of several trillion crowns. The worst value for money in the history of macroeconomics since the construction of the Great Wall of China. The science was wrong. The results are in, the truth is out, the game is up, and the scare is over. I pray that this conference will join me in a formal declaration that the climate emergency is at an end. Děkuji.